The story of the Romanovs begins in the early 17th century, in a Russia exhausted by chaos, famine, and civil war, a time remembered as the time of troubles, when the throne was empty, pretenders fought for power, and common people suffered endlessly. Out of this turmoil emerged a 16-year-old boy named Mikhail Romanov, timid, inexperienced, and entirely unprepared to rule. Yet the desperate nobles believed that his family's name, connections, and neutrality would calm the land. When envoys arrived at the monastery where he was hiding with his mother, he reportedly wept and begged not to be chosen, but eventually accepted the burden placed upon him, becoming the first Romanov Tsar in 1613. His early reign was shaped by the determination to restore peace, re-establish order, and rebuild a country scarred by war. Over the decades, the Romanov dynasty strengthened its hold, gradually expanding territory, centralizing authority, and standing as the symbol of Russia's imperial identity. But the empire they built across 3 centuries would grow too vast, too diverse, and too strained for the old autocratic system to manage, and the dynasty that began reluctantly in a monastery would end violently in a basement in Yekaterinburg, consumed by the same pressures it had once overcome. The transformation of Russia accelerated dramatically under Peter the Great, the towering, restless Tsar who ruled with both vision and brutality. He traveled across Europe in disguise, studying shipbuilding, military structure, and modern science, determined to drag Russia into the modern age, no matter the cost. Upon returning home, he imposed sweeping reforms, reorganizing the army, building a navy from nothing, forcing nobles to shave their beards, and even changing the calendar. He built a new capital, St. Petersburg, on windswept, swampy land along the Baltic coast, declaring it a window to the West, and relocating the court there in a symbolic shift away from traditional Muscovite ways. Although his modernization campaigns placed enormous financial and emotional burdens on the population, they undeniably reshaped Russia into a European great power. His successors continued expanding imperial territories, from the vast Siberian forests to the borders of the Ottoman Empire. Catherine the Great further embraced European culture, bolstering education, sponsoring the arts, and extending Russia's borders through wars and diplomatic maneuvering. Under her reign, the grandeur of the Romanov court dazzled visitors, but beneath the glittering veneer, millions of peasants lived in poverty, bound by serfdom, and increasingly resentful of the nobility's privileges. The seeds of future unrest were already taking root. Throughout the 19th century, the empire continued growing, but so did the pressures threatening its stability. Serfdom persisted until the mid-1800s, trapping peasants in harsh conditions that fueled anger and resistance. When Tsar Alexander II finally abolished serfdom in 1861, he hoped the reform would modernize Russia's economy and reduce social tension. Instead, it triggered new problems, as former serfs were granted freedom without sufficient land or financial support, creating widespread frustration. Radical movements emerged, demanding greater political participation, equality, and rights. Alexander II, once hailed as the Tsar Liberator, was assassinated in 1881 by revolutionaries who believed violence was the only path to change. His son, Alexander III, reacted with harsh repression, censorship, and a revival of autocracy. He believed reform had weakened the monarchy, and so he tightened control, empowering secret police and suppressing dissent. For a time, these methods maintained stability, but only temporarily. The underlying problems, economic inequality, ethnic tensions, rigid autocracy, and lack of political representation, continued simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when they would erupt uncontrollably. When Nicholas II ascended the throne in 1894, he inherited a nation on the brink of transformation. Gentle, shy, and deeply devoted to his family, he longed for a peaceful life rather than the burdens of absolute power. But he was determined to uphold the autocratic tradition, believing it his sacred duty to preserve the authority of the crown. Unfortunately, Russia, at the turn of the 20th century, was rapidly changing, fueled by industrial growth, urbanization, and rising political awareness. Factories in cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow attracted thousands of workers who lived in crowded, impoverished conditions, and labor unrest became increasingly common. The empire's rapid modernization clashed with a rigid, outdated political structure, creating a mismatch that amplified social tensions. War with Japan in 1904 further exposed imperial weaknesses. Russia expected an easy victory but instead suffered humiliating defeats, which shook confidence in the monarchy. In January 1905, peaceful marchers led by a priest, Father Gapon, approached the Winter Palace to deliver a petition to the Tsar, pleading for better working conditions and political reforms. Soldiers opened fire, killing and wounding hundreds in what became known as Bloody Sunday. The massacre shattered the people's belief in the Tsar as their protector, sparking strikes, uprisings, and demands for constitutional government. Nicholas reluctantly granted limited reforms, creating a parliament called the Duma. But he maintained significant control and restricted its powers, undermining public trust. In addition to political turmoil, the royal family faced personal challenges. Nicholas's only son, Alexei, suffered from hemophilia, a life-threatening condition that caused uncontrolled bleeding. Desperate to save him, the family turned to the mystic healer, Grigory Rasputin, whose presence at court became a source of scandal and controversy. Rasputin's influence over the Tsarina, Alexandra, made nobles and politicians furious, and rumors of corruption and immorality spread throughout the empire, further damaging the monarchy's reputation. While Rasputin may have offered some comfort to the family, his involvement only deepened public distrust in the already fragile government. In 1914, the outbreak of World War I thrust Russia into a conflict it was ill-prepared to handle. Although patriotic enthusiasm surged at first, the Russian military quickly suffered devastating losses, equipment shortages, and logistical failures. Millions of soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Food became scarce, transportation systems collapsed, and inflation soared, leaving ordinary people hungry and desperate. Nicholas made the fateful decision to personally take command of the army, leaving Alexandra in charge of domestic affairs. With Rasputin advising her, the government descended into chaos, marked by dismissals, incompetence, and corruption. Discontent spread across all levels of society, from workers and peasants to members of the nobility and military officers. The Romanov regime, which once seemed unshakable, now appeared hopelessly out of touch. By early 1917, the situation had reached a breaking point. In Petrograd, striking workers and protesting women filled the streets demanding bread, peace, and change. Soldiers, exhausted and disillusioned, refused to fire on the crowds, joining the demonstrations instead. With the capital in upheaval and no reliable forces left to enforce his rule, Nicholas II realized his position was untenable. On March 15, 1917, he abdicated the throne, ending more than 300 years of Romanov rule. A provisional government took power, but it struggled to manage the ongoing war and meet the expectations of a population hungry for reform. Meanwhile, radical groups, including the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, gained support by promising peace, land, and bread. As politfactions battled for control, the Romanov family was placed under house arrest, moved from their palace to increasingly remote locations. They lived quietly, clinging to hope that they might be rescued or exiled safely, but the tides of revolution were turning against them. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power, overthrowing the provisional government and plunging Russia into civil war. Fearing that anti-Bolshevik forces might attempt to restore the monarchy, local authorities in Yekaterinburg made a grim decision. In July 1918, Nicholas Alexandra, their 5 children, and several loyal attendants were executed in the basement of the Ipatiev house, bringing the Romanov dynasty to a brutal end. The new Soviet regime attempted to erase their legacy, yet the story of the Romanovs persisted, a reminder of the profound upheaval that transformed Russia from a sprawling empire into a revolutionary state. The fall of the Romanovs was not caused by a single moment or decision, but by centuries of unresolved tensions between modernization and autocracy, wealth and poverty, tradition, and change. Their story is a sweeping tale of power, splendor, tragedy, and the unstoppable force of history. As Russia moved into a new era shaped by revolution and ideology, the old world of the Romanovs faded into memory, leaving behind a legacy that continues to fascinate, haunt, and captivate all who drift into the long, haunting history of Imperial Russia.